Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to the third in our series of virtual conferences on the challenge of rehousing Ukraine. I'm David Smith of the Affordable Housing Institute, co-host of this, along with my esteemed, distinguished British colleague, Derek Long. This panel will focus particularly on the challenge of the returning refugees and internally displaced people. This is the third, as I said, in a series of three. On June 8th, we did one on the situation now with speakers from, among others, the Ministry of Regions, Territories, and Community Development, Kyiv School of Economics, quantitative estimates. On the 15th, we dealt with the supply side challenges of rebuilding, including hearing directly from the chief architect of Irpin, which is already starting its rebuilding. This panel is about the people. We're going to be covering the refugees, the IDPs, the dispersed families. A week from now, there will be the World Urban Forum just across the border in Katowice in Poland. Approximately 12,000 people will be there. The rehousing of Ukraine and the redevelopment of Ukraine, I believe, will be a prime topic of conversation. Two of my AHI colleagues will be there. As I say, spreading the word and looking for allies. I will say at a personal level, that I think this is among the most challenging housing problems that I have ever encountered in 46 years of working in affordable housing around the world. Our work, AHI's work, on behalf of Ukraine and in concert with our Ukrainian partners will continue after the World Urban Forum. There's an EBRD conference in Lugano in early July that's going to focus on the reconstruction and the capital issues related to that overall development. We are planning to provide input into that. And in the meantime, if you are interested or motivated, we do have a resource hub, a landing page, whose link I'll show you in a little bit, or you can just plain email me. I am an actual person and respond to emails. We had two panels up to now, and I want to pull for your benefit some quotes that particularly struck me. More than 7 million people are refugees or internally displaced, and the number is rising. Indeed, I have heard higher numbers, which suggest that as many as one Ukrainian household in 3 is currently living somewhere other than where they lived 2 years ago, which is a number without precedent as far as I know. The housing damage as of 2 weeks ago was 40 billion USD and rising. Homes consistently came up as part of the fundamental fabric of the society. And what also came up, as many of us on this call know, is that purely private development will not produce enough affordable housing, especially when the system already needed reform and now it needs more reform. That was the first panel. Second panel, don't replace destroyed boxes with shiny new boxes of the same type. You have an opportunity to remake cities and you need to take it because some of the cities have architecture that date back to the Soviet era. To rebuild the city, it turns out it's more than money and more than people. It's heavy construction equipment and it's the ability to make decisions quickly. And that's very complicated because if you're trying to make affordable housing, you have to balance efficiency, affordability, and sustainability. But Ukraine can invent a system that is right for you and that is informed by other good and best practice. And you'll hear some more of that in today's panel. At AHI, we worked in post-disaster contexts around the world. And some things we have learned in the other places that we have worked, urban decisions have to be made from the ground up. I mean, literally, you have to think about what is under the ground. What is under the rubble, what is under the streets. Cities will be made into communities by bonds that people form with each other. And the third point I put there is one I learned in India. We've done some work with the Self-Employed Women's Association, helping poor, informally employed Indian women improve their own houses with their own labor. Nothing about us is for us without us. The people have to have visibility, they have to understand, and their voices have to be heard, they have to have input. They have to have the ability to veto things that are bad ideas, and they have to share in the value that is created. Meanwhile, something else I've learned about our work in America, all borders are porous. People, ideas, cultural trends, money, jobs, everything flows across borders. But markets like clear boundaries. There need to be rules, and rules need to be clear. The rules need to be understood by stakeholders. And with that as a context, we're going to hear about the challenges that Ukrainian people face now and how they're dealing with them, what they want, and what they're doing to make Ukraine a better future Ukraine. And for that, I'm honored to have as our moderator, Emily Channell-Justice of the Temerty Contemporary Ukrainian Program at Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. Emily, please moderate our distinguished panelists.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks for that introduction. I think you've really set out the scale of the problem. And I think this panel builds nicely on the previous panels by introducing a little bit more of this human element that's really essential to understand. I'll start with just two very brief slides, thanks to my colleague Lidia Kuzemska, who will be speaking first, just to give a little bit of a view of the scale that we're looking at in terms of refugees. So as David mentioned, the numbers of refugees that we have in coming out of Ukraine is really unprecedented. It's very difficult to count, not only because, as you rightly say, borders are porous, but lots of people are moving out of Ukraine, then they're moving further somewhere else. And now a lot of people are also moving back to Ukraine. So this fluidity is, I think, something that's really a challenge that's novel to this particular situation. And that we have to kind of keep in mind that the numbers you can see on this slide, that there are 4 numbers. There's border crossings, refugees recorded, crossings back to Ukraine, and then refugees who have registered for some kind of status. And so we have to take all of these into account just as we're looking at the potential for rebuilding within Ukraine. And I think it's also important to think about, successful rebuilding might also be an indication to others that it's time to come back to. So the fluctuations of population is going to continue. And then of course, the second major issue to deal with right now is internal displacement. The UN is estimating 7.1 million internally displaced people. Again, this is a number that I'm not sure if that's correct or if it's actually much larger. But we can see here on this very helpful map that the numbers of people who are moving into different places is quite large. And certainly it's cause for concern that there's still the potential for more movement as the war continues. So we see 1.8 million people around Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro, but if those areas start to feel unsafe, people might continue to move again and again and again. And so these multiple forms of displacement are something that we really need to keep in mind as we're thinking about that, in addition to individual people's actual needs and ultimately their desire to return home. So I just wanted to give a little bit of context before turning it over to our distinguished panelists. We have a really wonderful group here with us today who's going to give us so many really interesting and helpful perspectives. As far as run of show goes, each panelist will have about 10 minutes to present their information. If you submit a question to the chat for that panelist, I will ask it right after their panel. But at the end, hopefully, if all our panelists can stick to their time, then we can have a little chance for discussion among everybody, which would be great. So thanks for all our participants. Thanks for everybody who's joining us. And let me introduce Lidia Kuzemska, who's our first speaker. She's a research affiliate with the Refugee Law Project, and she'll be talking about the dispersion of refugees and their challenges. Thanks, Lidia.
Thank you, Emily. Let me share my screen. So thank you everyone who decided to participate in today's panel. I will be speaking about the current situation of IDPs on the data that we have for the moment. I'm researching internal displacement in Ukraine since 2014, and I wanted to give you a quick overview of what's the situation compared in terms of where people who were internally displaced in Ukraine are currently residing compared to how IDPs previously were finding different housing solutions. And we see in both cases, in the first wave of internal displacement, so you see the data on the left, is from International Organization for Migration report. IDPs before 2022, so in the first wave, were mostly self-reliant in trying to find different accommodation solutions. So we see a lot of renting options. So people were renting apartments, renting houses, or even renting rooms in apartments. Some of them were hosted by relatives and families. Very few people actually owned housing. So in these 8 years of displacement, very few people, only 11% managed to buy a house with a mortgage or buy a house and own it and live it in it. And there was quite small percentage of people who lived in collective centers, around 2%. What's the situation as of May 2022? Once again, we see that rented accommodations have the biggest share, 35%. A third of IDPs, thanks to generosity and hospitality of Ukrainians, is hosted by their friends or family members. Some 6% are also hosted by kind strangers. And then in the collective centers and camps, we see that around 4% are staying at the moment. When we are thinking about designing different housing solutions for the IDPs, we have to understand what kind of group of people it is. And of course, this is a generalization, but this is the information that we have at the moment about how IDPs are different from the general population of Ukraine. So we have higher percentage of women, 64%. Also, we have a lot of children. 56% of IDP households have one or more children of different ages. Also, we have around 9% of people who experience double displacement. So those who were displaced already back in 2014, 2015, and were redisplaced second time. And it's also important to see that IDPs live in different types of areas. So some of them live in large cities, around a third of them. A third lives in small towns and urban type, and another third live in rural areas. Why all these things are important? Because when we are designing housing solutions for IDPs, we have to keep in mind that this group of people might have more specific needs, and they might also have more specific challenges because of their displacement. This is information that will be available for you afterwards, also in Ukrainian, that you can compare displaced people to non-displaced Ukrainians. So one of the biggest challenges for IDPs, as it is for all Ukrainian citizens at the moment, is the worsening economic situation. For the IDPs households, 64% of those who were previously employed before the war lost their jobs among the IDPs. 57% at the moment do not earn any money, and they are reliant on the state support or support from the international organizations. Here you see the IDP's income after displacement, and you can see the big change and the dramatic impact on economic situation of the IDPs, especially on those IDP households who are led by single females. To those who are not very familiar with the current exchange rate, the minimum Ukrainian wage at the moment is 6,500 hryvnia, which is $220. And you see that at least half of the IDPs households, even bigger share of that, live on less than $200 per month. So the IDP-state relations in Ukraine was complicated, and there were many mistakes that can be avoided at the moment. I'm not going to be talking about the difficulties that were in the previous period, because we have to also give credit to Ukrainian government. A lot of improvements were also done. So let's focus on what can be done at the moment for the internally displaced people, thinking about their housing and property rights. So first of all, let's not expect that this situation is going to be short-term or even mid-term. Let's think about long-term. and then that at least some IDPs will stay in their new locations, in their new host communities. So first of all, we need to collect disaggregated data. So we need to know who are these people, what are their needs, what are their plans. Equally, we need to know about their host communities, what's their absorptive capacity, how many IDPs they can host, what kind of help they need. And all of these things have to be constantly monitored and used in the policy making. Second of all, there is an issue that responsibility for the IDPs issues is dispersed between different ministries, which cause some administrative delays, some change in regulations. IDPs are confused sometimes whom to contact and who is responsible for their issues. So what can be done is open and regular communication with the displaced people, with those people who are thinking potentially to return. So for refugees, what kind of support they will be able to expect from the state, and also communication with the host communities. Also, it's important to make clear for the IDPs who is the responsible state body for their current housing, for the rebuilding, and for the compensation of the damages. As all Ukrainian society and IDPs including are living in a state of uncertainty and they don't know how to plan their life in the future, it's important to make realistic and time-bound state commitment about what to expect from the state, what kind of support, and what's important, what not to expect from the state in terms of housing provision, rebuilding, compensation for the damages. And it's also important to make clear which groups will have priority for state housing and compensations. For instance, we know that there will be a lot of people who will need support and there will be competing priorities for the government. So it's important to make clear who will be the first in the line for state support and why, and to communicate it clearly to the public. Also, it's important to have a two-way cooperation between IDPs and host communities, including local authorities, business, third sector, and all the other actors that are involved on the ground. IDPs should be included into all stages of decision-making about the matters that concern them. And now it's more easy to implement. You can have public consultations with the IDPs and host communities. You can run some pilot projects and see what's the feedback. You can even have surveys and use, for example, Lidia. They run now as electronic surveys. So it can be also an option. And also it's important to make local community feel that they can benefit from hosting IDPs to enhance the social cohesion and avoid social tensions. And Ukraine is having a very good previous successful example of local integration of IDPs. And we see on this graph that around 90% of IDPs that were previously displaced in 2014-2015 felt that they were successfully integrated into the local communities. Let's now quickly think about people who might consider returning. And there are many factors that I listed here for those people who might be considering returning from Europe, and also those people who are now on the temporary occupied territories, or those people who were forcefully displaced to the Russian territory and who might be considering to come to Ukraine, to relocate to Ukraine. So among all these different factors that might be influencing, housing also plays a very important role. People have to know whether they have to, where to go back to, what kind of support they will be able to receive from the state, whether they will be able to afford to rent or buy their apartment or any other housing. All these different factors that I put it here also are influenced by people's aspirations. So we have this balance between aspirations to return and capabilities to return. So about the aspirations, we have no doubt that a lot of Ukrainian citizens want to return. And according to the latest data that I found, around 60 to 70% of Ukrainian refugees currently abroad are considering coming back to Ukraine. But we also have to think about, they also are thinking about their capabilities, what they can expect after their return. And what the state can do is actually enhance their capabilities to return. So provide support that is necessary in rebuilding, in employment, in housing, and supporting different projects that will be useful for the refugees. We might also think about the current situation that Ukraine might be EU member state, potentially. So some refugees that are currently abroad might stay abroad or might become circular economic migrants. So they might be circling between Ukraine and other countries, sending remittances, supporting Ukraine from abroad, and then coming to Ukraine. All in all, I hope that this information will be useful, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lidia. I think that is a really, well, I think you've given us lots to think about in terms of these kind of cooperative networks that need to be established. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this element of social cohesion and reintegration into host communities. And I think this is related. We have a question about, you know, kind of the proportion of IDPs there seem to be more IDPs renting than in the average Ukrainian population. So is this a barrier to social integration, you know, ownership versus renting, relationship with landlords, you know, people who have control to some capacity over IDPs' housing security? How are these related to each other?
Okay. I think in Ukrainian context, ownership of the property of the house is very important for people, especially for those people who lost their houses and they feel that they need some kind of compensation, some kind of restitution. So for this group, ownership will remain very important, and people will be trying to buy their home. But as I demonstrated, the economic situation might not be helping in these aspirations. So it will be just not realistic for people to take mortgages to be able to buy. In terms of proportion of people renting, yes, among the IDPs, of course, it's higher proportion of people who are renting. I think according to latest estimations, like 60% of Ukrainians own their housing, and around, I think 20 to 25% are renting. I don't see this being an issue if the renting market will be regulated, which is one of the intentions of the government at the moment, to make it safe and secure for both sides, to have these long-term, reliable contracts that both sides can maintain.
Great, thank you. And I'll ask a follow-up question as well. In terms of this sort of the kind of state programs that you mentioned, those are related to housing, but what might be the possibilities for some kind of economic contributions? And by that I mean, you know, you can't expect a sustainable kind of integration if you have an unsustainable economic situation. So how is there, and maybe not just state programs, but potentially international intervention, you know, what are the intersections there between the economic stability of a region or the country as a whole and the potential for return?
Yeah, so when we are talking about local integration, two key aspects is housing and job. So these two comes together. You cannot have one without another, and you will not feel integrated into the local community, because also there is this element that you are contributing to the local labor market, you are contributing to by paying taxes, by volunteering. All these kind of aspects are important. So what can be done is supporting people with renting, supporting people with starting their businesses, creating employment opportunities. There is a wide range of things that can be done, but always it has to be, this is what I want to stress, IDPs and host communities need to be consulted, need to be included into this dialogue to see what are the local capacities, what are the local needs, what are people's plans, what do they want to do. That's why we need data, we need to know what's happening on the ground.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those excellent answers. I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker, just so that we have time to put everyone in conversation with each other. For those of you who have just joined us, you can submit questions in the chat and we'll give them to each panelist after their presentation and then have time for open discussion at the end. So our next speaker is Olena Lukaniuk, who is the legal advisor to the UN International Organization of Migrants, and she'll be talking about what refugees want to come back to. So Olena, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be part of this very important discussion. Let me start a bit, before I start with bombing you with numbers and figures, let me a bit pour a light on the determinants of today's Ukrainians who are still on move. I'm talking about Ukrainians in general and in particular about my family. We are currently displaced from capital city Kiev to western part of Ukraine. And initially the main determinant for that was that we have 2 kids and we decided not to put too much stress on them. So it happened over 3 months ago and we are still mentally on move. Which means that we are not completely confident that we can return back to our home city or move further to some of the Western countries. And here I want to, first of all, echo a bit some remarks which the previous distinguished speaker did about why people are doing this or that decision. For instance, if we are talking about the renting of housing or ownership of housing, so this the reluctancy of people, why they are not doing the final decision, this is because this is the mental status of displacement or the move. For instance, just to give you an illustration, in early May of this year, the state registers of the immovable property of the real estate was reopened, which means that in principle, their operations on the real estate purchase of housing was allowed, and because initially it had been closed after the imposing of the martial law. But still, the real estate market is dead. Which means that even people who can in principle afford housing, they do not do that because they are not confident that they will stay in this or that location. So after this presentation of actually myself and decision making inside the Ukrainian head, let's move on to the figures. As the distinguished moderator started to say about the numbers and figures on the movement of people, so in starting from 24 February, the exact number of crossing of the borders of Ukrainian borders made 9.3 million, of which 5.7 million, this was exiting Ukraine, and around 3 million it's entering Ukraine. But here we also have to take a note of the multiple crossing of the state border, which is done either by relatives who are taking care of their elderly members of family who normally stay inside Ukraine, and so they are shuttling in between the elderly members of their families inside Ukraine and kids who are outside Ukraine. Also, these are the moves of the trucks with the humanitarian cargos, and also the moves, multiple moves of the volunteers. In general, the majority of those ones who left the country are women, kids, and elderly population, which is 60 plus, because other categories of population who are men in between 18 and 60 years old, they are under the conscription and they are prohibited from leaving of the country. And in the mid of May, the incoming flows of Ukrainians started to be bigger than outcoming flows of Ukrainians. And there are several reasons for that. The first and utmost reason is that since 2017, Ukrainian nationals are allowed to for visa-free regime with the EU states, and this visa-free regime means that people can stay inside the EU countries for 90 days, and once this term started to expire, those Ukrainian nationals who did not intend to obtain any kind of refugee or any kind of residence registration, they just had to go back to Ukraine. Second main reason is, of course, the financial reason. Because with the start of war in Ukraine, the Ukrainian government provided the support for the employed population who lost their job in the amount of the average salary, which or the minimum salary, which Lidia had already mentioned, and people simply exhausted their means for living, and they had to go back to Ukraine because the cost of living inside Ukraine is lower than inside the EU. So these are in a nutshell what had happened through the last 3+ months. So let us move to the next. So where people do return. So the majority of returnees return to north of Ukraine. And the reason behind is quite simple. This is because this is the part of Ukraine bordering Belarus, and Russian troops were withdrawn from that part, or officially withdrawn from that part, and that constitute the sort of illusion of security, and people tend to return back to their hometowns. Also, if you might notice quite a big number of people who returned back to eastern part of Ukraine, which exceed 800,000 individuals. This quite big number, and everybody can be surprised by such a big number, as the security situation in eastern part of Ukraine is very tense. But we have to keep in mind that the general density of population in eastern Ukraine is 2-3 times higher as compared to other parts of our country. So in general, it's over 4.4, which were indicated by the report of our organization by the IOM at the end of May of this year. I just take this opportunity and can promise that the forthcoming days, the next round, the 6th round of this report will come, and we will have the fresh numbers. So just do not take it to exact these numbers, which are a bit outdated. So also the number of IDPs dropped in total 11%. since the beginning of May till the end of May, from 8 million to 7.1 million people. And out of these flows, only 7% are refugees, and the rest, 93%, are IDPs. So I'm talking about the total number of returnees. Despite the big numbers, still people are moving inside Ukraine, which first means that the movement inside Ukraine is still possible. This is mainly by railway connections and road connections. And second, yeah, as I initially told, it means that movements is quite intensive in general. What people, when they return or if they are on move, what their main needs and challenges. So 64% of people reported that they lost their job, and due to the ongoing situation with the martial law, the labor legislation has been more strict, has become more strict for the employed population. For instance, if under the, let's say, normal situation, if anybody loses his or her job, they still keep receiving first 2 months 100% of their salaries, next 2 months 80% of their salaries, and then 50% of their salaries till up to half a year before they can find the job. Now this term, because of the martial law, was reduced to 1 month. And after 1 month, people are forced to go to the low-paid jobs, or they can even be invited to the job with jobs with the restoring of the critical infrastructure of cities and towns, or some other types of the community engagement, let's say. Yes, and also the figures which we have, these are 23% of current IDPs plan to return home in the next, in the forthcoming weeks. And the reasons behind, I mentioned. The first one is the financial reason. The second one, which is related to refugees, is that their term of presence in the Schengen zone, in the EU countries, is very close to expire. Yeah, and what I can also add is that on the top of all these figures, I would mention that the survey done by the IOM also indicated quite a risky trend, is that 44% of respondents mentioned that they struggle to avoid the malnutrition of their children. So they literally are struggling to find cheaper food, which is as useful as it can be for the kids, for the minors. Actually, this is a situation of war. The situation is being deteriorating. So this is the trend, and this is obvious. The second trend which I would mention is the efforts of the government of Ukraine, which I already mentioned in my speech, to mitigate the risks and the losses by Ukrainian population. So I mentioned the initial support by the government of Ukraine for people who lost their jobs. Now quite a number of programs being announced by the government of Ukraine to support the micro and small businesses, which could potentially allow for people and for the businesses to survive. Hopefully in the forthcoming months, people will make their minds what they are going to do next after their physical and mental movements are over. Zooming what we call in the humanitarian response shelter needs and the repairment needs and the needs for the housing. Quite a big number of IDPs and returnees, they mentioned that they require the repairment support. We are talking about the damaged housing, which can potentially be used at least during the summertime. So still people tend to go back home and to revive somehow their households, and this is the trend we have to recognize. The figures are 33% of respondents of returnees from central part of Ukraine mentioned that they need some shelter materials for repairments, and 21% of respondents mentioned that they need the materials for repairments for the northern part of Ukraine. Yes, and also because of the damages to their housing, 12% indicated the need for the non-food items, which are some materials for the households like linen, blankets, mattresses, kitchen sets, other types of materials. Well, going closer to the situation with the housing. So we estimating how acute the restart of affordable housing in Ukraine is. We have to reflect a bit on the situation which we had before the war. So we do not start from the scratch. Before the war, there were over 10 national affordable housing programs which were operating. Which means that there were the financial instruments and the capacities in the capital construction to provide the housing at the relatively affordable price. Also, the government of Ukraine drafted the new housing code of Ukraine, and partially it became a part of legislation on the 21st of April this year. And it was what is called the decommunization draft law on the legislation. And in particular, it renamed the Soviet housing code of the Soviet Ukraine into the housing code of Ukraine. Also, before the war, there were quite a number of pilot interventions through the development funds, which were targeting the capital construction area or the renovation of the existing housing stock into the modern housing. And actually, I represent one of the programs of the IEM, which is called the Affordable Housing Program. Because of the self-evident reasons, we put on hold our regular operations. And now we are dealing with a humanitarian response to the ongoing humanitarian crisis, but still we hope to return to business as usual, to our regular program and to do some positive positive interventions in terms of construction or reconstruction the housing units for the vulnerable populations, primarily for the IDPs. And one of our focus is the cluster related to potential of rent-to-own modality for the housing stock. Because as Lidia mentioned in her speech, one of the biggest aspirations for the average Ukrainian family is to have the housing in their ownership. I can add that before the war, 94% of housing stock in Ukraine used to be in private ownership. That's why people do tend to have this modality, and hopefully we will have the opportunity to continue this work. But coming back to our realities, for me, the biggest question when it comes to the affordable housing in the humanitarian response. Because as we keep mentioning, so the humanitarian crisis is huge. We are talking about millions of people. We are talking about billions of cost of damages. So here we have to be we have to undertake a very well thought through approach on to balance the necessity for the huge humanitarian interventions versus the risk to get the addiction to the humanitarian support. That is why, in terms of calendar, I would say that as in any normal stages of the humanitarian response, first we have the emergency response, which we have now. This is just free support to people who are in need. Support with the basic things, support with the free housing, support with some sort of repayments whatsoever. The next, hopefully, will come the repairment and restoration of the critical infrastructure of the country. And only then it will come to the permanent housing. And hopefully this will be the modality of the affordable housing, which I'm a big fan of. In calendar terms, the optimistic forecast for that, I would say not earlier than 2024. For the mapping, again, given the stages of the humanitarian interventions and given the security preconditions, as for any critical infrastructure repairments projects or housing projects, before that, it should be the demining of the territories. And optimistically, again, it can take a few years before it can come to the start. So thank you for your patience and for your attention. And I'm ready for the questions, if any.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing so much helpful information. And I think we'll all look forward to the new data that's coming out soon. I think we just have time for one question, and it's about the status of IDPs. So when we're talking about the return of IDPs, are we talking about those who have received the official status of IDP? And what's the kind of information that we have about this? Because people have to register as IDPs in order to receive services. So does your information include only officially registered persons, or does it also include people who are displaced but are not officially registered as IDPs?
Okay, talking about the discrepancy in official number of the registered IDPs, which you mentioned in the beginning of this panel, and which makes 3.4 million of people, and the let's say actual numbers of IDPs, which we mentioned 7.1 million. Yes, there is this discrepancy, and the IOM is dealing with reported numbers, not official numbers. And the logical question why this discrepancy appears. The first one, the first reason behind, under the current situation, this is the conscription issue. Because as I mentioned, male Ukrainians, they are under the conscription, and some of them is, so I wouldn't name the regions, but some of them do not register as IDP because they are afraid to be conscripted to the army. This is true. Second reason, which we inherited from the, let's say, first stage of invasion by Russian Federation into Ukraine, which happened in 2014. And then, if you might remember, the government of Ukraine and the parliament of Ukraine reacted quite quickly. And the first law on the status and, on the rights and freedoms of IDPs was approved in October of 2014. And this first wave of IDPs, of course, it was a pilot of the state scale, but still, this first wave of IDPs came across the numerous realms of discrimination in numerous spheres. That is why people, especially from eastern part of Ukraine, currently are quite cautious to register their family members and themselves as the IDPs. Third reason, this is, as I call the mental reason, the mental reason of traveling, yeah, inside somebody's head. Yeah? So people do not register at some location because you physically has to go to the point of registration to provide the documents whatsoever, because they are not confident that they will stay in this location. That is why this situation will stabilize in the forthcoming half a year, I would say, and then we will have less discrepancy between the official number of the registered IDPs and the actual number of IDPs or refugees. And I think your question is very much relevant to the refugees, because not every Ukrainian is eager to receive the resident status or the refugee status in the country where he or she is present currently, and the reasons behind are more or less the same.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that answer. So I think we'll go ahead and move on to our next panelist. That will be Tamas Vonyo, who is Associate Professor at Bocconi University, and he'll be speaking about the historical challenges for reconstruction. So Tamas, over to you.
Thank you. I hope you can see my slides. Yes, perfect. So thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, David and Derek, for inviting me to join this panel. It's really an honor, not least because I'm an outsider here. I'm not a Ukrainian expert. I'm not a housing expert. I'm not an urban development expert. What I am an expert of is the economic history of modern warfare in Europe. And in this context, I have done extensive research on post-war reconstruction, especially in the context of the Second World War and the years that followed in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, in this context, the best known and by far most extensively studied case is that of Germany, or more precisely West Germany after the Second World War. Now, you may ask, why this comparison, what we can learn from this? Unfortunately, parallels have been made in the last 3 months between the current conflict and World War II. Since 1945, this is the first time we see an armed conflict which produces the numbers of destroyed housing units that we spoke about, the numbers of IDPs that we just discussed. David himself in his introduction said that in his long and distinguished career, this will probably be the most challenging reconstruction episode that he has ever seen. That is probably because even David is not experienced enough to have seen reconstruction after World War II. Now, there are a couple of other good reasons to study this case. One is that at the start of the two respective wars, the two countries actually had a very similar population. So what became West Germany after World War II and Ukraine before the respective wars that we study here had a very similar population, had a very similar share of cities in the total population as well. In both conflicts, we see both destruction of physical assets, including housing, and displacement of people at an equally large scale. So the interaction of the two is very important to understand the complexities of reconstruction. And finally, this is a historical case where both destruction and displacement during the war and reconstruction and resettlement after the war are extremely well documented. So there is a lot of historical literature that we have here, a lot of key facts that we can highlight, and some of these are quite informative to our discussion today. So I will give you just some headline figures of what happened to West Germany during and after 1945, and immediately I use these on the next slides to draw conclusions or takeaways for today. So the Western Allies dropped about 2 million tons of explosives on German cities in the 1940s. And in the territory of what became West Germany after World War II, this meant a total destruction of about 3 million housing units, about 3/4 of which were in medium and large cities. So destruction rate in urban areas was extremely high. In rural areas was an order of magnitude lower. Now, of these 3 million dwellings, about 1/3 was rebuilt in the late 1940s. But the housing census in 1950 enumerated a massive shortage of housing, about 5 million or 50% of the existing housing stock, which came not just from wartime destruction, but also as a consequence of a significant pre-war deficit, and an even larger additional post-war demand because Germany, for various reasons, increased its population in the 1940s, especially due to mass influx of German-speaking refugees from East and Central Europe. So the first important takeaway when we talk about reconstruction and the relationship between housing and displacement, or destruction and displacement, is that post-war housing requirements depend on war damage only or only partly depend on war damage. There are three important components that we have to assess in order to understand precisely post-war housing requirements, both at the national and regional level. First, you have to have a very clear assessment of the pre-war housing situation, and it's very good to see several presentations on that already. It's very clear that at the national level, Ukraine must have had a significant housing surplus, the quality of which is questionable, but quantitative terms for sure. Why? Well, first, because the country had a population decline of about 20% since independence. And at least for the last 10 years, we have seen a significant rate of construction. So on the one hand, you have a maintenance or even slight increase of supply in recent decades, but a significant reduction of demand. Now, this means that in certain regions that were unaffected by the war, you must be able to recognize significant housing surpluses that, if well coordinated, can be effectively used and mobilized for post-war rehousing, especially in the years before the reconstruction of the largest cities like Mariupol can start. Now, about wartime destruction, we have seen one estimate so far in this conference series, which is generated by new technology using satellite and drone images, according to which the Ukraine may have lost up to 400,000 or 500,000 housing units. So far, it's a fairly small part of the pre-existing national housing stock, but this number will grow very quickly given the incredible speed of destruction, and the proper assessment will only be made after the war. But this single most important component, I believe, in the Ukrainian situation will be population change. And this is why it's good if I follow up the previous two presentations. We have seen the incredible numbers in displacement caused by this war already. And if we compare it to destruction of housing, it's very clear that displacement is disproportionately bigger than destruction. Right? So this is why, to figure out the post-war housing requirements, both at the national and regional levels, an accurate assessment of the likely return rate of refugees from abroad and the likely resettlement pattern of internally displaced people will be critical. Just to give you a shocking figure, I learned from Lidia's presentation that the current best estimate on the likely return of refugees is somewhere between 60 and 70%. The difference between 60 and 70% currently is 600,000 people, right? And of course, much bigger differences between likely scenarios can exist. So let's then move on to rebuilding. So let's go back once first in history. How was Germany or its western part rebuilt? Well, the short answer is that for the first couple of years, not at all. And this is because before rebuilding, they had to remove about 300 million cubic meters of debris. As you can see in the picture, this is mid-20th century construction technology. So you had to remove this enormous amount of ash and rubble by hand. This was completed in 3-4 years in smaller cities and the countryside. In the bigger cities, it had barely begun. Until 1949. Now, once rubble removal had been completed in the reconstruction phase, the country, once again with a not much larger population than today's Ukraine, had to build 500,000 housing units per year for more than 10 years just to clear the estimated housing shortage. Now you can see here that 55% of this was social housing. So the state played a huge part. In Germany, it was easy, once again, linking back to previous presentations, because unlike Ukraine, Germany is kind of the other extreme of the international spectrum in rental versus owned housing. It's a very, very long history that goes back to the 19th and early 20th century. Among all major Western countries, Germany always has the highest share of rental housing. So biggest cities, only 10 to 15% of the houses are owned, the rest is rented. And this made it very easy for German governments at the time to provide subsidies through subsidized rents, rent ceilings, national and regional rent policies. Now, the economic cost of reconstruction was enormous. Until the late 50s, almost half of all construction was in the housing sector. And in a period where the economy was growing very fast with very high levels of investment, 1/4 of all investment in the country went into housing, 1/3 of which was again funded by the state. Now, we can have several takeaways from this, but I wanted to focus on one, which until about 5 minutes ago, I believed would be the first major challenge of reconstruction. But I learned something from Olena's presentation, namely that this might be only the second. So I want to focus your attention here on the monumental task of rubble removal. Olena mentioned that it might only happen after demining, which I did not take into consideration. But this is very important that you cannot start rebuilding the day after the war is over, especially in the larger cities. The removal of rubble is first and foremost very important to properly assess the damage. Right? As David said, we don't know what's under the rubble so far. Also, you will have to clear space for reconstruction. So especially in large cities, rubble removal and rebuilding cannot really take place at the same time. One has to follow the other. And since in large cities, reconstruction will take place with a lot of heavy equipment and moving hundreds and thousands of tons of material at one time, you also have to remove rubble to facilitate transport. Now, you still have to do it quickly, especially because the likely return rate of refugees and internally displaced to their original communities will depend on how quickly those communities can be rebuilt or how quickly the rebuilding can begin. So how can you implement rubble removal on a massive scale quickly? I would say by following two different strategies. In small communities, try to delegate both power and resources to local communities, because local construction companies and citizens can effectively implement this task if they are given the resources and the flexibility. But in the largest cities, especially with high rates of destruction, you cannot do this alone. It's very hard to estimate, but given the numbers I've seen in the case of Mariupol, the rubble to be removed is probably going to be somewhere around 50, 60 million cubic meters or even more. This will require international aid. And the most important aspect of international aid will be to collect enough heavy equipment that can remove and transport the debris, and also then to move in the humongous quantities of basic construction materials for the reconstruction to start. So in a city like Mariupol, this would mean keeping there thousands of units of heavy equipment, cranes, heavy bulldozers, excavators, drillers, and the like for a year or even longer. Now, if you know the construction industry worldwide, you know that it's only the biggest global companies that possess this kind of capacities. But if you know this industry, you also know that capacity planning is the most neurotic part of their business. So in order to secure the necessary capacities in heavy equipment for rubble removal and the very basic reconstruction activities in large cities, planning should start already now between the relevant parties at international level, contacting these big global construction companies to make sure that they can plan ahead and free up enough building capacity to complete this job when the guns go silent. And only then you have to figure out how to fund this, but I believe the next speaker is a much bigger expert on that than I am. So this is where I will finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think this is a fascinating comparison, but and kind of presents the difficulties facing Ukraine, but also helps us, I think, not get too mired into the I'm not sure the word, despair, for lack of a better word. So we have a few questions. One of them is about this kind of your environmental remediation laws. So lead-based paints, asbestos, petrochemicals in the soil, destroyed buildings means rubble containing these hazards. So how do we deal with that? I mean, we also have a comment on here about rubble removal and decontamination and recycling potential as building material multiple uses. So how can we think about the kind of environmental implications of this rebuilding? First of all, now that we have more information about these environmental issues and the potential contaminants issues, but that we're also, talking about supply chain issues, equipment issues, getting stuff to a place to rebuild. What's your take on how those things are all intersecting?
Yes, so, it's a very good question. This makes, the situation even more complicated. So once again, I can stress planning, and start now, right? Especially when you're thinking about how to do this in the biggest cities where you can't just rely on local resources. So once again, national and international experts obviously will have to be involved in including experts of particular industries where the destroyed plants belong to, that who can provide details. I think the example of Mariupol is also very good to highlight. Another important issue is that, where to clear the rubble first, and therefore where to allow rebuilding first. Because as I said, in large cities like that, where you have tens of millions of cubic meters of rubble, at least certain districts you have to clear before rebuilding can start there. And then, the important thing is, do you want to start rebuilding Azovstal, or do you want to start rebuilding the housing sector, which will house the people who will work in the factory that, on the other hand, is the economic basis for the sustainability of the entire region? So, there are various, and generally the bigger the scale in terms of how big the destroyed cities are, the more advanced planning you have to do. And really what I can stress is try to have differentiated strategies of different size cities. You have to apply a completely different strategy for this in small communities, including suburbs of cities, where one of the other reasons not to get too involved and delegate as much power and resources as possible, because otherwise it becomes an impossible coordination tasks as well, right? You can plan nationally and internationally reconstruction in 5-10 very big cities, but coordinate rubble removal and then reconstruction along more than 1,000 small communities would be impossible anyway.
Yeah, excellent point that I think has come up throughout several panels. We have lots of different scale to think about, and we have to take different communities' needs into consideration. So thanks for putting that into a really important context. Since we are getting short on time, we still have 2 panelists left. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next panelist, which is Friedemann Broy, advisor to the Vice President, Interfinance Corporation, who's going to be talking about affordable housing as part of economic development. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Emily, and hello to everybody. So I will talk a little bit about, I think one aspect we have talked very much about the current status and of course about the situation of the refugees, but where I would like to focus today's presentation is more on how we can finance the reconstruction or the rebuilding of the housing stock. And during, let's say, the short time I have available, I would like to talk a little bit about what would be adequate models to refinance the reconstruction based on the experience with disaster financing and also rebuilding economies. But of course, the models I will present or the ideas will basically cannot cover the whole universe of financial needs. So I think according to my assessment, we need probably a combination of different models to fund these huge amount necessary. And then I think I will also talk a little bit about what could be the role of development financial institutions. How can they support this reconstruction process? And I would like to focus on 3 ideas or models which have been actually already been tested. Is the covered mortgage bond, then funds, and there I would like to focus on one fund called the European Fund for Southeast Europe, which, if I know, as far as I know, it also already is operating in Ukraine, so that maybe could be actually a vehicle which can be also used to start funding the reconstruction, or even, let's say, defining some short-term solutions for those people who return, and then of a crowd funds, which could be also an opportunity where people can put together volumes of savings. And I was thinking here of the importance of remittances. I don't think that Ukraine, according to my knowledge, is a country which benefits from a lot of remittances, but that would also depend from people who may not decide to come back, but who still would like to support this effort of reconstruction, rebuilding, and that can happen through remittances. The reason why I manage remittances is that remittances have been in other parts of the world a very important part of financing housing. And to a large extent, the flow of remittances is much higher than, for example, the flow of FDI. So I think that could be something which could be also taken in consideration when we're talking about financing. I think for the messages is, I think for me, the one most important channel or source of funding would be, in my view, actually the capital market. Because first of all, there are vast amounts of finance available. And second, also, it would also allow for the strong engagement of the private sector, which would probably be required to provide funding, because governments, the Ukrainian, or even if we take in consideration maybe donations from other governments, will not be sufficient to finance this huge effort. And I think this has also been shown in Germany. Of course, at that point, the government was heavily involved, but there was also a lot of private capital involved to support this. And then, as already mentioned, the combination of different resources would be required. And yeah, the capital market, I mentioned this. With that, I think. Okay, so first of all, what is needed? And I think that has been already quite nicely demonstrated by Tamas in his previous situation. I think we are talking here not only of housing per se, which is needed, but we're also talking here of infrastructure, rubble removal, and rebuilding also requires huge chunks of materials, equipment, which Ukraine probably needs to import because they may not even in the capacity to produce as much materials as necessary. And then I think also capacities and expertise is needed, what to be doing, not only in terms of, I think, of design the right financial models, but also what would be an appropriate approach of urban development. How do we want to rebuild the cities? Do we want to rebuild a city like Mariupol in the same way as it was? Or maybe there are ways to do it in a better way, for example, in a greener way? Do we want to use also different type of materials we used to before? Because we have also to think of climate change, and that housing constitutes at least for 27% of global global gas emissions. So I think that's something. So on what could be adequate resources? I think, as I already mentioned, it's a capital market, it's governments, it's the international community. I would think here development financial institutions, but also some philanthropic funds which might be interested to support the rebuilding effort. And I think also the European Union. I understand that Ukraine has applied for membership to the European Union. And I think, as far as I've followed the news, this will be decided this week in Brussels, whether this will move forward. And since I worked on the, in my research was focused on the impact of the pre-accession agreements of other Eastern European countries, I know that also then once a candidate status has been confirmed by the European Union, that would also mean a massive amount of funds to support basically the change of regulation, basically the adoption of what in Europe is called the acquis communautaire, but also I think also in terms of competition and support to the structure. So that could be, I think, in my view, also a very important channel to support the rebuilding of the country. So what would be the role? What would be the role of DFIs? I think when I was thinking yesterday, when I started doing the presentation, I think one key advice would be actually advice, because I think where the DFI community can be useful, they can first of all convene, they can bring together experts from different corners of the world, and they can also see, look, they saw what happened in other countries in other parts of the world, and then they can give also some feedback what may work in the particular context of Ukraine. So I think that is something which seems to be quite valuable. The second part, of course, we can provide finance, but that would be probably the smallest part, because usually I think when I look at IFC's mandate, we have a broad responsibility for other countries. Of course, this will become for IFC or the World Bank a major priority, but there is other priorities. So I guess the amount of money available would be probably much smaller than, for example, what the European Union can provide, or even the Ukrainian government. But I think where the role of DFIs can be very effective is in the form of risk sharing, in terms of guarantees, in terms of first loss guarantees, or maybe also covering some currency risks in terms, for example, if a lot of amounts have to be paid in euro or in US dollars, but revenues will be only generated in the Ukrainian local currency, then the repayment could be to massive foreign currency risk. And I think that is something where I guess, in my view, DFIs can be of help and to cover here some of the risks. So coming now to the instruments, I think there are 3 points. The 1 point is the covered mortgage bonds, then I think the fund, and then also crowdfunding. So what, in a nutshell, what is a covered mortgage bond? This is basically a pool of mortgages, specified dynamic mortgages, which will be served as a cover pool, as a additional layer of security for the issuances of bonds. So why I mentioned the covered mortgage bonds, I think 1 point is because it has actually originated in 1795 in Denmark, when there was a huge fire in Copenhagen, and when the government was basically, here was rubble and so on, the government had more or less a similar task, of course, on a much smaller scale, what is now happening in Ukraine, but basically rebuilding Copenhagen. And since the government, the coffers were empty, they were thinking of issuing a bond over the capital market. And then that was the origin of the development of the covered mortgage bond scheme. What the nice thing is that this developed over 300 years. It has been adopted in most European countries. It is a very well-established instrument. One other advantage I would see in the covered mortgage bond also, as it is designed, it works without any state guarantees, without any state money. And I think it will also allow for a flow of long-term funds. I understand that according to my knowledge, none of the regulation has been already established to allow for this fund, but maybe some discussion have already happened. So what could be a good idea, I think, is maybe to start to check whether that could be maybe also an instrument to use local capital market resources in Ukraine to start developing the right legislation and also secure some of the funding necessary. The other point is what I would like to emphasize, or what I like to mention, is a fund structure. And I think here is also some historical context. This EFZE fund, which I have here modeled shown as a model structure, has been actually established to support the refinancing or the rebuilding of the Western Balkan countries like Serbia, Kosovo, and Bosnia, to refinance the rebuilding and the reconstruction of these 3 countries after the war in the Balkans. And I think, of course, at that time, the governments of Switzerland, Germany, and Austria, and the European Union, they provided funding of about 200 million euros, but then they realized this is definitely not enough to pay for all the efforts. And then they were thinking, how can we bring in the private sector to mobilize more capital? And then they came to the idea to establish the European Fund for Southeast Europe, which is a debt fund, which offers investors different layers of risk according to the risk appetite where they can basically invest. And to make this all appealing and to provide some coverage for the risk, the equity part, which you see on the left-hand side, was basically the contributions by these governments, which I mentioned, which served basically as a risk buffer and which was absorbing in case this fund is exposed to major losses, so that basically the senior debt holder would be protected in case of a loss. So this whole fund started, I think I was working on the feasibility study of this fund, started somewhere in the year 2005 with feasibility studies to assess the demand. And then the whole thing was set up in sometimes 2008, started with around $350 million. Now this fund has outstanding assets under management of more than 1 billion euro. It funds SMEs, agricultural business, it funds housing, and it has been also expanded to other countries, also to Ukraine. I don't know whether there are already some discussions ongoing using this fund. IFC invested, EBRD invested, the European Fund for Reconstruction of Development is also invested in this fund. But I think that could be maybe a vehicle which could be also used for short-term solutions to provide funding to returning people to Ukraine. But I think definitely something similar I would probably recommend, or as a model to see whether either the existing structure can be used or a new fund for, especially for Ukraine, can be set up. And I think this is also something which could be very interested for the DFI community to be involved and also to support. And that could be also maybe also proposed in the framework of a European model of support towards Ukraine. I think the last point is, given since the time is a little bit fast, is about the crowdfunding. And I think that was for me more triggered by the idea, can we mobilize remittances from outside Ukraine to support the reconstruction? Where basically small amount of funds would be channeled into these type of structures, and then they can be used either for rebuilding or also cover other needs. Okay, I would like to stop here because I think we are running out of time, and I think we are still having one speaker.
Yes, thank you so much for your attention to the time. We'll be going no more than 15 minutes late for, hopefully everybody can stay and join us, but that won't give our final panelists enough time. I have a couple of questions for you. First of all, there's some discussion in the chat about working specifically with different oblasts, so the different regions in Ukraine. But it's important to remember, as we're talking about different strategies to employ, that decentralization reform has been in progress in Ukraine since 2015. This given it a lot more autonomy to communities, to amalgamated communities or hromada. So how can you give us any sense of how to provide advice, not just at this national level or at the regional level, but at this very localized level where a lot of the decisions are actually going to be made, if, as you say, advice is one of the key points of your proposal?
That is a good question. I think when I look at financial models, of course, when I look at a model like the covered mortgage bond, this is something, of course, the legislation will be introduced on the national level. But I think then who issues these bonds, which would be usually banks or specialized mortgage lenders, then the funds can be deployed, of course, also regionally. I think that I don't see there any issue. And but maybe in terms of a mix of, because that's also the beauty of this very flexible cover pool of mortgages which can be used. And then, of course, there could be maybe some kind of a concentration to certain regions. On the other hand, I think fund structures can focus on certain regions, but probably in terms of risk diversification and mobilization effort, it might be useful to think something more on a national level and then to starting breaking down. I think another area which I have not covered would be definitely municipal finance. That would be if municipalities would issue bonds by themselves to fund the reconstruction. And yesterday I talked to a colleague from the European Bank from the IEB, the European Investment Bank, and he mentioned to me actually that in Poland, a lot of municipalities issue now bonds without any sovereign guarantees, and they have apparently implemented a very interesting model for financing, but also deployment. Unfortunately, not much experience has been written down on him, but I think I have encouraged him to work maybe to share this knowledge more broadly, because I have the impression when we are talking about housing, I think what seems to me key is here not only talking about the reconstruction of the housing, I think it should be embedded in a wider urban development effort. And I think that is also what Tamas pointed out in his presentation. It does not make sense just to having somewhere a housing committee. If the people have no roads where they can go to their jobs, if there is not a functioning fabric or employment opportunities, then the most beautiful houses will not be of help. So I think the reconstruction effort, in my view, should be embedded in a broader urban development context and not only just looking, okay, we need to, of course, I understand the urgent need to rehouse the people, but I think it should be also integrated in a broader strategy. And I think that here, the regional structure of Ukraine could actually be of help to do this, because then you're talking with much smaller entities where it would be easier to get things moved instead of, let's say, finding a first solution on the national level and then break it down.
That's a great perspective, and I think our panelists have really agreed on that assessment of the kind of intertwining of these two capacities. I'm going to move to our final panelist. I do want to point out, thanks to Olena and Lidia for providing some information about remittances. I think this is something you brought up, but that could certainly be kept in mind as something that is substantial, as a matter of fact, in terms of funding for Ukraine. So there's a couple of links in the chat for anyone who's interested. So finally, our last panelist is Drita Shabani, a housing consultant based in Kosovo, who will be sharing some lessons from Kosovo's return and rebuilding. So Drita, please go ahead.
Hello to everyone. I'm honored to be part of this panel, talking about Kosovo's experience of reconstruction after conflict of 1999. I will start immediately. I will begin with some basic information in order to have an overview of housing ecosystem in Kosovo before of conflict of 1999. Kosovo was one of the least developed regions in ex-Yugoslavia. The majority of the Kosovan housing stock consisted from privately owned individual housing, with about 95%. The mass construction in Kosovo happened later than in other regions of ex-Yugoslavia, starting with 1970s, 1980s, when started an economic development with new working places. I want to mention that about 70% of population was unemployed at that time. As socialist state, ex-Yugoslavia provided a measure of subsidy in housing, which consisted with public housing in public land for social enterprises employees, based on their contributions from their salaries. Those apartments have been privatized by the users beginning from 1997, as in other countries in the region. Public housing constructions have been done based on use standards that time, which were in line with German DIN standards. This housing stock was managed by housing public enterprises, and there have been some limited possibilities for loans in housing. Now, when we talk to war damages, I will be concentrating war damages in housing. The conflict most severely affected housing, agriculture, and telecommunications. More than 120,000 houses was damaged or destroyed. More than 1.8 million people displaced. Just to have you as an overview that Kosovo had around 2 million people before the conflict. It was the need for emergent sheltering. More than 50% of agriculture assets were reportedly damaged or lost. At that time, no any institution was functional, national institution. It came to mobilization of international institutions by creating the management organizations. European Commission started establishment of task force with headquarters in Pristina, who together with other international organizations started to prepare the donors conference, which held in September 1999. This was the preparation start of the preparation phase for reconstruction. So with installment of task force in Pristina by the European Commission, which followed as European Agency for Reconstruction. European Commissions asked from the International Management Group, IMG, to carry out rapid housing damage assessment. We are talking for the period of time around June and August of 1999. Food and agriculture organizations supported by World Bank staff carried out a wide agriculture damage assessment, while UNHCR took care on managing of return of the displaced population and providing emergent sheltering. That time, UNMIC mission served as administration body because, as I said, no any established institution set yet that time. So they just started with first steps towards establishing of national institutions. You can say too many organizations were in just preparation phase, and we can see that the result it wasn't so as we desired. Here we have a table with IMG assessment when you can see the categorizations of damages from 206,000 surveyed housing units in Kosovo, but or more than 120,000 were reported damaged or destroyed. Around 500,000 people couldn't inhabit their homes at that time in the end of 1999 because they were in category 3 or 4 of damages. If you see the table, you can see that more than 58% of housing stock was damaged or destroyed. Reconstruction with repair activities and the construction of 75 square meters houses was estimated to cost around $1.1 billion US. Here we have some examples of the houses by the categories. We have some figures, which I would not stop too much here because we have no time. We'll go to next slide. The reconstruction of the houses has been done based on the UNMIC guidelines for reconstruction, which was developed based on members of families. As you can see, the standards were too low. No matter what the size of the house was before the conflict, the maximum new constructed house was 75 square meters. And those are very low standards under the old minimum standards for housing. But we should mention that we started from zero. The financial situation in Kosovo was catastrophic that time. And I want to show one of challenging of all involved organizations was the return of displaced people. You can see here a returnee that says that fortunately we are alive, but now we need help for rebuilding the house, food, and other essential things for life. And you see here a picture with house before and after reconstruction. As you can see, the standard was very low of reconstruction, even without thermal insulation. Maybe you know that despite appeals by NATO and UNHCR to be patient, refugees began to float back in Kosovo, and 700,000 people returned to their destroyed properties within the first 3 weeks. This was very challenging to all involved parts. UNHCR, together with thousands of NATO troops, began to work of helping hundreds of thousands of people rebuild their homes, remove rubble, make some reconstruction of infrastructure, access to food, water, and electricity, and so on. Because there were too many people returned, and the houses were burned yet, UNHCR and other European, American, and other government agencies rushed shelter kits, allowing families to weatherproof at least one room in a destroyed house before the weather comes. Rebuilding activity was followed with several problems, and I will list some of problems experienced in Kosovo. I understand that the situation is not the same to Ukraine because you have your government, and we haven't maybe not to say nothing that time. The management, planning, and reporting structures were often cobbled together in ad hoc manner. Planning and implementation reconstruction projects proven to be far more challenging than expected. Late establishment of national and local institutions led to informal developments, including illegal constructions. Weak cooperation between international and national institutions and between international and themselves resulted in the duplication of actions. Some ad hoc rebuilding without good initial information from international officers and experts resulted in not proper solutions and under substandard constructions. Emergency need led to overcrowding and lower quality of life. Substandard constructed buildings generated serious challenges for future spatial planning. New constructions have been done in all places, not with any before urban or special planning. I want to show you, I think, is a good practice or a good example for reconstruction is Tumane settlement in Albania. Tumane was informal settlement before earthquake of 2020. The majority of poorly constructed houses stock were destroyed from the earthquake, and national and local institutions accommodated the families in buildings for tourism like hotels, motels, or private houses with rent, which was paid from the government. That time, too many financial support came from EU, US, and other countries worldwide. But what is good to mention here is that the assessment, planning, and implementation carried out by the government established management group. It was an opportunity to new special planning of the zone, and the settlement became a planned settlement which ensured sustainable return in new standardized neighborhood with social infrastructure in place which before missed. And in the end, a state which overcame the war, we can share our experience and some lessons learned from the reconstruction phase, which can help Ukraine for better management of the past war reconstruction. We understood that success in post-conflict reconstruction depends on understanding the complexities of the political environment, not just in Ukraine in state, but and geopolitical environment. Coordinating projects in an effective manner and involving a wide range of community stakeholders. The accuracy of initial damage assessment is crucial. International actors should involve national experts and professionals from the beginning of reconstruction planning. That ensures clear understanding of the legislation and regulatory framework, making reconstruction easier. Accurate designing of the phases and planning of the human resources orients the process in the right direction toward effective reconstruction. Involving the owners of damaged properties from the planning phase make implementation easier. And as we know, all know that reconstruction means more than a roof over people's head. It's need more intervention and infrastructure in health buildings, schools, community gathering buildings, but also supporting the livelihoods through job creation and income generating projects are as well as critical. Hoping this phase of reconstruction will come soon and will be done in the best way possible in Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Drita, for that excellent comparative example. I think there's so much to learn. And actually, unfortunately, we're absolutely out of time, but I really hope that this opens up another space for us to have further discussions about comparative examples, lessons we can learn from Kosovo and other countries. So I'll turn it over to David for the final word, but let me thank all of our panelists and our participants today.
Thank you.
I do want to start by thanking all the panelists. This has been a mountain of work, and there is a good record of it. I have a few takeaways, and I will do them in 60 seconds. Every panelist who has come on this panel and the two previous panels added something to the complexity of the problem. If a problem seems insoluble, enlarge it. That's a quote from Dwight Eisenhower, who was Supreme Allied Commander in the Second World War. It's important to look at all the elements of the challenge, because if you design a solution based on partial sectors, you will not get something comprehensive. I did like tremendously Olena's, Lukaniuk's comment that if you're displaced, you are still on the move mentally. People need tools, they need rules, and they need stability. Time limited, holidays, permissions, whatever the relief is, whatever the materials are, people can only plan the future when they have a certain amount of certainty, and certainty starts with the family outward. Ukrainians, I have tremendous respect for. I'm honored by all the people who came on this. I think there's an immense amount of capacity in Ukraine that knows what it wants to do, lacks resources to do it. For the rest of the world, it's up to us. What do we do to help? We're going to the World Urban Forum. We intend to make Ukraine a topic of conversation. The World Urban Forum, there's a Lugano, a European Bank for Reconstruction and Development conference into which we'll be providing input. I am committed to finding as many ways as possible that the resources of my little organization can be placed at the disposal of the rebuilding and rehousing of Ukraine. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. Thank you for an energetic chat. Thank you for all the ideas. Please stay in touch. Please thinking about Ukraine, and onward to the future. Bye-bye.